Before there was a United States, before the stars and stripes, before the idea of freedom echoed across the land, there were nations, great, powerful, and ancient. Their stories were whispered by the wind, carved into mountains, and buried beneath the forests of time. This is the America that existed long before America itself, a world of builders, dreamers, and warriors whose empires rose and fell long before a European sail touched its shores. The land before history. Long before the first European explorers gazed across the Atlantic, North America was already a living mosaic of thriving civilizations. From the icy plains of Alaska to the sun-scorched deserts of Arizona, millions of people called this continent home. They were farmers, astronomers, engineers, and poets. They traded across thousands of miles, from the jungles of Central America to the rivers of the Great Lakes. In today's history books, these stories are often reduced to a few paragraphs, but in truth, they were empires, complex societies that understood the language of the earth, the stars, and the seasons better than most people do today. Imagine standing atop a massive earthen pyramid, taller than a 10-story building, surrounded by thousands of homes, marketplaces, and ceremonial plazas. The air is alive with the scent of corn, tobacco, and fire. Drums echo across the valley. This is Cahokia, the city of the sun, the beating heart of ancient North America. Cahokia, the lost metropolis. Located near what is now St. Louis, Cahokia was once larger than medieval London. By the year 1100 AD, over 40,000 people lived here, a city built entirely of earth, wood, and human willpower. Massive mounds rose like pyramids, aligning perfectly with the solstices. Archaeologists still marvel at its engineering precision, a calendar city designed to track the sun's movement. But Cahokia was more than a city. It was a symbol of unity. People came from distant tribes, speaking different languages, to trade copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, and obsidian from the Rockies. Its leaders ruled through ceremony and belief, not just warfare. The people worshiped the sun, the giver of life, and their culture revolved around harmony with nature. Then, one day, it ended. By 1350, Cahokia was abandoned, its mounds overgrown, its people vanished. Why? No one knows for certain. Some say famine, others disease, still others climate change or internal conflict. But the silence of Cahokia remains one of the greatest mysteries of early America. Voices of the forest, the eastern nations. Farther east, great forests stretched endlessly, home to the Iroquois Confederacy, the Cherokee, and dozens of other nations who called themselves the people of the Longhouse. Their societies were democratic in ways Europe had never seen. The Iroquois League, formed long before the U.S. Constitution, brought together multiple nations under one council, where peace and unity were law. Centuries later, Benjamin Franklin would study this confederacy and draw inspiration from its political structure when helping design the foundations of the United States. The idea that different states could unite under one federal system, it wasn't born in Philadelphia. It was born in the forests of ancient America. The architects of the desert, the ancestral Puebloans. To the west, where the desert meets the sky, lived the ancestral Puebloans, builders of cities carved into cliffs like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. Their stone homes rose from the canyon walls like honeycombs. Hundreds of rooms, circular ceremonial chambers, and stairways carved straight into rock. They tracked the stars with astonishing accuracy. They knew when to plant and when to harvest by watching the alignment of sunlight on their walls. Some scholars call them the astronomers of the ancient world. But just as mysteriously as Cahokia fell, so too did Chaco Canyon. By the 1300s, the great cities of the Southwest stood silent. The people moved, perhaps chasing water, perhaps following prophecy. Their descendants, the Hopi and Zuni, still tell the stories of their ancestors' migration, not as a tragedy, but as part of the cycle of renewal. The frozen north and endless plains. Far to the north, the Inuit and other Arctic peoples thrived in a world of ice. They built homes from snow, fashioned tools from bone, and mastered the harshest environment on Earth. To the Great Plains, the Lakota, Pawnee, and Comanche hunted vast herds of buffalo. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons, guided by stars and stories. These were not nomads without history. They were astronomers, diplomats, and warriors. Their oral traditions preserved history as vividly as any written record. A continent of many worlds. From coast to coast, the Americas were not empty lands waiting to be discovered. They were worlds within a world, each with its own language, belief, and destiny. Over 500 distinct nations existed, trading goods, art, and ideas across thousands of miles. And yet, even in their diversity, one truth connected them all: a sacred relationship with the land. The earth was not property, it was a living being. The rivers were ancestors, the mountains spirits. They did not own the world, they belonged to it. Cinematic transition, tone shift. But then, the horizon changed. One morning, far across the endless sea, sails appeared, white as ghosts, silent as destiny. The old world was coming, and with it, everything would change. The year was 1492, and the strangers were almost here.
The wind carried the scent of salt and destiny. Across the Atlantic, 3 wooden ships pushed through uncharted waters, tiny specks against an ocean that seemed endless. On board were men who dreamed of gold, faith, and glory. None of them could imagine the world that waited beyond the horizon. The first footsteps. When Christopher Columbus set foot upon the islands of the Caribbean in 1492, he believed he had reached Asia. Instead, he had stepped into a continent that had already been civilized for thousands of years. Villages of the Taino people dotted the shores, organized communities with agriculture, music, and trade. At first, there was curiosity. The islanders offered food and gifts, the sailors offered beads and mirrors. But curiosity quickly turned to conquest. Within a few short years, diseases carried across the ocean. Smallpox, measles, influenza spread faster than any sword. Where drums once echoed, silence fell. Entire populations vanished. Yet even in tragedy, these first encounters marked the collision of 2 worlds, the old and the new, each forever changed by the other. The age of exploration. After Columbus came the flood. Spanish explorers Cortés, De Soto, Coronado sailed with flags, faith, and steel. They sought cities of gold, legends of eternal youth, and glory for distant kings. What they found was more complex than any map could show. They marched through jungles shimmering with heat, across rivers that seemed without end, and into civilizations that dwarfed their imagination. In the south, the Aztec and Maya empires fell to conquest. In the north, explorers wandered through lands ruled by the Mississippian descendants, guided or sometimes hunted by nations defending their homes. The chronicles they left behind speak of wonder and fear. They wrote of temples that glowed at dawn, of cities built upon mounds of earth, of warriors painted for battle. But their pens also recorded devastation, a world undone by contact. Seeds of change. By the mid-1500s, European settlements began to appear along the eastern coasts. The Spanish claimed Florida and the Southwest. The French sailed down the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. The English gazed upon the foggy shores of what would one day be Virginia and Massachusetts. Each power carried a vision. Spain sought empire and conversion. France sought trade and alliance. England sought a new beginning. For the native nations, these arrivals were both opportunity and threat. Some forged alliances, trading furs, weapons, and knowledge. Others resisted fiercely, determined to protect the land of their ancestors. And still, across the forests and plains, the ancient ways endured. The ceremonies continued. The languages survived. The old stories whispered that the earth remembers even when men forget. The forgotten mapmakers. Long before colonial surveyors drew lines across the continent, native cartographers had already mapped its veins. They read rivers as sentences, mountains as paragraphs, the stars as punctuation in the story of the world. Their maps were songs, passed from mouth to ear, from elder to child. European explorers often survived only because indigenous guides showed them where to walk, where to drink, and where not to die. Without them, history might have ended on the edge of the wilderness. Yet, most of their names vanished from written records, replaced by those who arrived later. History remembers kings and captains. The forest remembers guides. The Great Exchange. With contact came the greatest biological and cultural exchange in human history. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes traveled east to Europe. Horses, wheat, and iron tools traveled west. This Columbian exchange reshaped diets, economies, and ecosystems across the globe. But behind the trade came the shadow: disease, slavery, and war. Entire nations like the Taino and the Beothuk faded from existence. Others, like the Cherokee, Navajo, and Iroquois, adapted, blending old knowledge with new tools. The world was no longer divided by oceans. It had become a single, trembling web. Echoes of resistance. In the decades that followed, native resistance became legend. From the forests of the Northeast to the deserts of the Southwest, leaders rose who refused to surrender the earth beneath their feet. The Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, the Pequot in New England, and later the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, all stood as proof that the spirit of the land could not be easily conquered. One by one, alliances shifted, wars erupted, treaties were signed and broken. Yet amid the chaos, something invisible was forming, a new identity, a blend of cultures, beliefs, and survival stories that would one day define America itself.
transition. Slow, reflective music. History is not a straight line. It's a river, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, always moving.
Before the flags and the colonies, before the ships kissed the Atlantic shore, this land already had a name, a heart, and a voice. It was the voice of the ancients. The rivers that would one day bear European names already had stories whispered into them. To the peoples who lived along their banks, the Mississippi was not just a river, it was a living being, an eternal highway that carried the breath of creation itself. Across the great continent, from the red cliffs of the Southwest to the forests of the Great Lakes, vast nations and intricate cultures thrived long before a single colonist ever set foot here. The architects of the earth. The ancestral Puebloans, known to archaeologists as the builders of Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, mastered the art of stone and sky. Their homes were carved into cliffs, glowing golden at dawn and cooling in the shade by noon. Each room, each stairway was aligned with the stars. Every solstice, beams of light slipped through narrow slits in the walls, touching sacred symbols, marking the rhythm of time itself. To them, architecture was prayer, and astronomy was devotion. Farther east, in the humid cradle of the Mississippian civilization rose around what we now call Cahokia, a city of earth pyramids, bustling markets, and grand temples that rivaled the size of medieval London. Cahokia's central mound, Monk's Mound, stood as a silent mountain of human ambition, constructed by millions of baskets of soil. From its top, priests and leaders watched the sunrise over a grand plaza filled with thousands of people. Music, fire, and ritual filled the air. Trade winds and paths of power. 1,000 trails crossed this land. The Hopewell and Adena networks carried obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf, and turquoise from the Southwest. Trade was not merely exchange, it was diplomacy, culture, and communication. Stories, myths, and beliefs traveled with the goods, weaving the continent into a web of shared ideas long before maps existed. In the dense forests of the Northeast, the Iroquois nations, ancestors of the Haudenosaunee, formed complex alliances. They were philosophers as much as warriors. Their governance, a great law of peace, valued consensus over conquest, a model that would later echo in the birth of American democracy itself. Few realize this. The concept of federal unity under shared law, the very spine of the U.S. Constitution, was inspired in part by these ancient confederacies. The sacred balance. To these civilizations, the earth was not property, it was kin. Each mountain, river, and animal had a spirit. A hunt required prayer, a harvest required thanks. This balance defined survival. When drought struck, or when game disappeared, tribes moved, not in defeat, but in respect for the shifting will of the natural world. Their myths spoke of cycles, creation, destruction, rebirth, a world where humans were temporary guests, not masters. Among the Navajo, it was said that the world was woven by Spider-Woman, who spun harmony into being. Among the Lakota, life itself was Wakan Tanka, the great mystery, an unseen force that bound all creation. The land was alive, and in return, it nurtured one of the richest tapestries of cultures on Earth. Storms on the horizon. But even the greatest societies are fragile before time.
As centuries passed, the Mississippian mounds grew silent. Fields went untended. Fires faded on temple tops. Historians still debate why. Was it climate change, warfare, disease, or a slow unraveling of faith and leadership? Perhaps, like all great empires, their end came not with an invasion, but with forgetting. Cahokia was abandoned long before Europeans arrived, its plazas filled with grass. The once great trade routes became paths of memory. And yet, their influence remained. The descendants of these mound builders became the tribes of the Southeast, the Choctaw, Creek, and Cherokee, carrying fragments of ancient knowledge into a new age. Echoes of the ancestors. By the 1400s, when Europe began to look westward, North America was not an empty wilderness. It was a continent of nations, over 500 tribes, languages, and belief systems, each deeply rooted in the land. They had governments, cities, medicine, astronomy, agriculture, and oral traditions older than many European kingdoms. But history would soon twist their story. A storm of sails and iron was gathering across the sea, and it would rewrite the destiny of this land forever. When the strangers came, they did not arrive to discover, they arrived to encounter.